Welcome, everyone. This is the new Statesman and Spotlight's latest global policy forum on the subject of sustainable recovery. This session in particular is on the vital subject of the ethics and politics of the climate crisis and its implications for human rights and equality around the world. And you can find it on Twitter using the hashtag NS Global Policy Forum. We have two compelling speakers lined up, the first of whom, Jamie Margolin, I'm hugely excited to introduce, especially having just finished reading her book, Youth to Power. It's a super account of how to work out what it is you really care about and then start organising to protect and grow it. Jamie is also the co-founder of the youth climate justice movement, 0 Hour. She is a film student at NYU and a plaintiff in a lawsuit against the state of Washington over its role in the climate crisis. We only have 15 minutes and there's so much I'd like to ask, but perhaps we could start with how you personally came to realize that it was the overlap of issues of climate and inequality that was so important, and in particular, and whether there are any particular issues or places around the world today that are drawing your attention.
Well, the first time I really realized the overlap of the climate crisis and social justice issues, it wasn't like there was one moment. It was like a gradual learning. So I remember my early moments, I think when I was 15, working with a community organizer who was, kind of pointing out how the issues didn't affect one person, didn't affect everyone the same, but they affected different communities differently. And so, but that wasn't like the moment that my eyes opened up. I would learn from another organizer and then another organizer, and then I would see something with my own eyes. And then and so the knowledge just kind of stacked and stacked until I got the full picture in my mind. And I was like, oh, okay, this isn't just climate change and social justice. These are intersectional issues. That's how learning works for a lot of people. It's not like you just learn it once. It's just like through experiences, your eyes start to open to the reality of the world.
Yes, of course. And is there anything that's particularly making your eyes open today?
I mean, the intersections of the climate crisis and the COVID-19 crisis are really intersectional, especially in the way that governments have responded with COVID. Speaking from the American perspective, our government waited way too late to start. The Trump administration was like covering things up and pretty much just trying to maintain status quo to avoid having to actually deal with the issues at hand. And that led to thousands and thousands and thousands of preventable deaths. Similarly to the climate crisis, leaders are putting it off, covering stuff up, which is also causing thousands and thousands and thousands of preventable deaths. And so we see with both crises how so many deaths and suffering could have been prevented because there are solutions to both of these issues, but it's the greed and I would say ignorance, but it's really not because they know what they're doing. It's the greed and callousness of the people at the top who have the power to prevent all of these deaths, but decide it's not worth enough money to stop it. And so that's really something that's been unveiled recently with the COVID-19 crisis.
I suppose one of the other things COVID-19 has really brought home is how often disasters often impact the poorest and most vulnerable the worst, which is obviously true for climate change as well. And relatedly, I'm interested to know whether the pandemic has also posed a challenge to the activism that hopes to address all of those challenges, or whether kind of people being online more has made activism easier or stronger, or if not being able to get out in the streets has had an effect.
I mean, it's definitely been a lot more difficult because as we're doing right now, usually I bet I would be going to this event in person, and here we are on Zoom. And while we are able to communicate, it does get exhausting. And I think everyone at all different fields and levels are very zoomed out. Like everyone has doing Zoom. It's like, okay, thank you. Enough of that. It can get tiring to stare at a computer screen all the time, but sometimes that's all we can do for different people who are quarantined. And so it definitely has made activism a lot more, it definitely has made the experience of activism much different. But I'm not going to say that it's completely ruined it because we find a way to take action anyway. And there are other countries outside of the United States that have, are able to do more in-person stuff, but we particularly in the country that I'm in are in a very bad place. So we can't do that. But I know people in other countries are starting to be able to get back to it.
Your book is a super outline of how to get involved in activism, and the youth movement in general seems very good at providing this kind of organizing information on individual issues as well. But just this week, we've seen a backlash against Greta Thunberg for tweeting a toolkit of actions for those wanting to support farmers in India who are protesting new laws. And I think the Delhi police have accused her of an overseas conspiracy. And I wondered what you think global activist movements can do to help stave off such accusations.
There's nothing you can do to stave off an accusation. People make up lies about people all the time. People try to hurt people all the time. There's nothing you can do to like shield yourself from people lying about you or from people framing you for something, or like, I don't know, Greta tweeted what she thought was best to support this strike or this protest. And look, I don't know the exact specifics or what were in the document or what the issue is, but I know that there is a lot of, when people speak up, and I've been speaking up about the farmers' protests, and while I haven't been receiving the same backlash as Greta, there are a lot of people in my comments being like, you get out of here, you don't know what you're doing, you're horrible, you're helping fascism or whatever. I don't know, like you speak out and you can, I don't know, people can say crazy things about you all the time. People can make your name trend like Greta Thunberg exposed. They can make that trend on Twitter anytime. It's really just about sticking to what you know is true and sticking to the facts and sticking to what is right. And there's nothing we can do to prevent trolls, liars, anything like that. But we can always speak out about what's right. And the truth always prevails, in my opinion. So there's a lot of noise on Twitter, but in the end, the truth will prevail.
And is there also a risk that organizing at a global scale and communicating in this way, which has so many benefits, also risks perhaps losing some of the nuance and understanding of some of the issues involved? Again, with the protests in India, some have pointed out that current farming practices are actually very bad for environment and climate too. And I wonder how activism, which relies on getting everyone interested and involved, can be careful of that as well.
Well, I mean, nothing is black and white. Like, we need to support farmers protesting for their rights, but I'm also sure that you're right about, some of the farming practices being bad for the environment. We can simultaneously support people and standing up for their rights as farmers while also encouraging and fighting for more sustainable practices of farming. It's not like you can suddenly discredit the farmers' protests because some of their farming practices are bad. Like, okay, valid, but people are protesting for their human rights. We should listen to them, get them what they're demanding, and then work on like, okay, how can we correct some of these farming practices and to make it more eco-friendly? Like you don't have to pick between what you support.
And we've seen recently in the US a slew of new climate policies from the Biden administration. And I wondered what it is that he might do that would really be an early indicator for you that the US is kind of on the right path and heading in a better direction again on climate issues.
I'm very only cautiously optimistic because there was also a report that I guess it's been pretty buried because it doesn't really align with the narrative, but Biden has approved a bunch of new drilling permits on, I think it's on public land, which is also what he's simultaneously advocating against. So he has been giving out drilling permits, and he has been negligent to support the Green New Deal. Like, he hasn't come out in favor of the Green New Deal. He's still very pro fracking. And so while I'm encouraged by stopping the Keystone Pipeline and rejoining the Paris Accords, these are like tiny steps that I feel like the administration has a long way to go. And they're trying to paint themselves as like, we're super eco-friendly and do everything perfect. When in reality, it's like, okay, those are great first steps, but I need you to keep going and to go a little further. You stop the Keystone Pipeline, excellent. Now cancel the Dakota Access Pipeline and stop Line 3. You're rejoining the Paris Agreement, cool. Now support a Green New Deal, So I'm not saying the Biden administration is bad or good on this. I'm saying that I see like embers of both kind of what could be, and I really want to push him to the side of like being a climate champion. It benefits all of us if he and Kamala are climate champions, but we can't just sit back and expect it to happen. We have to be actually pushing for it. And we have to be critical. Like, look, I can be happy that the Keystone Pipeline was stopped while also being critical about the new oil permits. So it takes a nuanced approach, I think, with this administration.
Thank you. And then globally, it can often feel like the climate movement, political movement on climate is just not happening anywhere near fast enough. Is there any changes to systems of international politics or law or governance that you would like to see introduced at a more kind of system level?
I mean, it would be great if each country had its own like Green New Deal type thing of like exact plans of how to get down to the emissions and create a just transition based on what each country needs. I feel like that would be great. The Paris Accords are not legally binding, so it's just what people say they'll do, but then a lot of people have not been actually doing what they said. And plus, even the accords themselves are not strong enough. So I feel like there's a big gap. While it is the Paris Climate Accords are a big like step in the right direction, we need to be, I feel like each country needs to be moving beyond speaking and going into actual action.
And finally, amidst all the gloom, what or who are you finding most inspiring at the moment?
At the moment, I'm finding a lot of the protectors of the Amazon really inspiring. They've been fighting for so long, and just seeing a lot of the indigenous people, you know, fighting to protect the Amazon rainforest and the green spaces of our world. I don't even just find them inspiring right now. It's just like a consistent thing of just, I really look up to these people, and my family's from Colombia. And so seeing like a lot of the indigenous Colombian activists, I just feel like I really look up to them, and I'm thinking like, wow, you guys are really doing the important work. And I just look up to like many Colombian activists right now. Colombia is the #1 deadliest place to be an environmentalist. It has the highest rates of murders of environmentalists. And so seeing what's happening back in my family's home country is very disturbing, but it's also incredible to see these activists taking action in spite of that. Now, and this is another international thing that I want to see passed, Escazú, which is like a Latin American pretty much climate treaty that needs to be passed. Also has a whole thing about protecting environmentalists, because murders of environmentalists are a big thing in Latin America, not just in my family's home country, but all over the continent of South America and Central America and in the islands. So I think it's really important that Escazú is passed and ratified, and that we take action to protect the organizers who are being killed.
Thank you. Thanks for all of that and for joining us. And huge good luck with all your work and campaigning. And
thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And I think we have another speaker lined up next. Welcome everyone, and especially welcome to Tasneem Essop. It's lovely to meet you. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the online editor for the international side of the New Statesman, and I also write regularly about a whole range of environmental issues, most recently a piece on China and Biden and climate diplomacy. And Tasneem, you have a stellar record working on issues surrounding climate, energy and social justice, including senior positions in government in South Africa and for the World Wildlife Fund and for the UNFCCC at the Paris Climate Conference. And most recently as executive director of the Climate Action Network, which is a worldwide network of NGOs in over 130 countries working to promote truly sustainable development. And it would be great to start our conversation, which I think is going to run for about 15 minutes, with how you found the last year with the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic, and how you've found that interacting with climate issues and these issues of social justice you've been working on for so long, and how it's maybe made it more visible and maybe shown how much we need to be prepared for future crises.
Thanks very much, India, and thank you again for inviting me to do this interview. Yeah, I think that, you know, entering 2021, it's impossible for us to look at what needs to be done, the work that we have to prioritize in this year without looking back at 2020 for all of us across the world. You know, the COVID crisis impacted us in very different ways, But I think there's not a single person who cannot ignore the fact that the biggest lesson out of the COVID crisis, and as you said, what's been made visible, it's been there for, of course, decades and decades and decades, but what's been made visible is the unbelievable levels of inequality that exist in the world. And so the one clear message that, or lesson that we got out of the COVID crisis, and then being compounded and converging with the climate crisis, because as you know, there were so many extreme weather events at the same time, people were trying to cope with the COVID pandemic. That kind of convergence, the kind of multiple shocks that people were experiencing were the same sections of our society across the world. So those living in poverty, those suffering inequality, those who suffer racial injustice, those living in conflict zones, etc., etc. These are the most vulnerable, the frontline workers, frontline communities. And so the pandemic hit them hard. The climate crisis hits them hard. And so all of these multiple crises compounding and converging with each other essentially tells us that if we're going to be doing work going forward on climate, we cannot ignore these other crises. As I said, they're all integrated. The solutions that we have to find need to be integrated, and we would have to prioritize the needs of those who are most vulnerable. So for sure, financing to help build resilience, what does that mean? And these are not big solutions, simple things like having proper, decent housing, for example, that would also, ensure that when we do have extreme climate events, but also when we have pandemics that require social distancing, all these things can be looked at in a very practical way. And so it's important to recognize the convergence. It's important to look at integrated solutions that can help with all addressing resilience to multiple crises for these vulnerable peoples and communities.
It's so interesting, everything you've just said. And I was just wondering if, I know the world is only beginning to start rolling out the vaccine and look at relationships between different countries for vaccine sharing and distribution, but are there any lessons, is there any positive signs you've seen during the pandemic of countries working together that could be applied to tackling future kind of multiple climate events?
Look, I think there are attempts at working together. So I know that under the, under the World Health Organization, especially attempts to look at access to poorer nations, to developing countries. But it's not going far enough. I'm sure you would have read, the conduct of rich countries who have just bought up the vaccines. There is going to be inequitable access between countries and then within countries between rich and poor. Again, another lesson. Yeah. What we've seen, for example, with the COVID, in 2020, with the COVID crisis, many rich countries we know of, the US, the EU, even the UK have put in place recovery mechanisms, their stimulus packages, etc., all taking care of, and rightly so, their domestic needs. But what we missed, and what was not clear enough was the international solidarity piece. And we would need that international solidarity piece to address not only a health crisis, but it gets taken into how we also deal with the climate crisis. So for a long time, for example, vulnerable countries, the poorer countries who are suffering the worst impacts of climate change and who are least responsible for it, and that is exactly the fundamental justice issue, they have been struggling to get the levels of resourcing to deal with climate impacts. So the issue, for example, of what we need to address the kind of losses and the damage that's already being experienced, the resources are just not forthcoming for that. And so again, that is essential if we want to have climate justice. It is essential in terms of international solidarity. And so again, the lessons of COVID, I just feel that if rich countries have not seen this, through the COVID crisis, and it has not actually landed in terms of their consciousness, which we can still see, it hasn't landed, that there is a huge problem of inequality between countries. But the other thing that is clear, and I'm sure, India, you would have seen this during 2020, that even in developed countries, we have inequalities. In the US, it was extremely visible. In the UK, for example, when you read that school children are going hungry, then this is not just an issue that has to be addressed in terms of inequality between countries, but also within countries. And we have to, again, as I said, put the vulnerable at the forefront of the solutions to all these crises.
And is there, obviously, the pandemic came slightly more of a surprise. Nations are already working towards these kinds of issues on the climate. Just yesterday, the UN Secretary General made a plea for more funding for adaptation projects in developing nations, and the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has announced a new climate adaptation coalition for this kind of support. Are these signs that we're going in the right direction, but also what would you like to see done to really kind of meet the need?
No, I think that's a good start. And let me be honest, it's come, especially in the UK, with the UK being the COP president at the end of the year, there was immense pressure for this COP presidency to take the issue of adaptation, of loss and damage, and of building overall resilience as a top priority issue. So the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which is a forum made up of most of the vulnerable countries, this is their top priority, and specifically loss and damage. So yes, it's really good that the resourcing should be prioritizing adaptation. But as you know, and as we've seen, especially last year, there are things that we're not going to be able to adapt to any longer. And so how do you, and it's already happening in many poor communities across the world, where we're beyond adaptation. And that's where the issue of loss and damage comes in. And I do want to be very clear that, loss and damage has been a very controversial or politically difficult issue in the negotiations in the UNFCCC. Rich nations would really like to ignore the fact that they have responsibilities to also deal with loss and damage, and vulnerable countries, those least responsible, are talking about reparations, etc. Now, it's very easy, and most times, people talk about climate justice. We need climate justice. Even governments are talking about climate justice, etc. But then we have to be absolutely clear about what that means. And climate justice means that you have to be prepared to give reparations, compensation for the loss and damage that people are experiencing based on others' actions. So this is very good to hear that the adaptation resourcing will come. Let's hope that many countries will ensure that the coffers get filled. It was an adaptation fund, or there is an adaptation fund that did not see the levels of funding that was required before. So I'm hoping this time it really isn't just about, we'll set up funds, we make announcements and commitments that the money will really flow into those funds. And the UNEP gap adaptation report showed that there's huge gaps in resourcing for adaptation. So yes, good that it's moving. And we will, of course, as civil society, make sure that we keep the pressure to get the money flowing into the fund.
No, it's great that there's some movement on, well, more movement now on adaptation funding. You mentioned loss and damage and reparations. Is there a kind of mechanism that you would like to see set up that you think would work for something like that?
There is a mechanism in the UNFCCC, the Warsaw mechanism. We just have to make sure that it's, functioning. Again, we don't need to reinvent things. There are structures and institutional arrangements put in place to deal with all of these things. Where it's getting stuck is the kind of politics of the matter. And we need rich countries, and in the last negotiations that we had in Madrid, COP25, the US didn't play a good role. In fact, they were the ones at that time that actually put their foot down, even though they knew they were going to leave the Paris Agreement. And they just put their foot down on loss and damage. And so certainly we hope that with this new US administration and with Biden and the commitments that they've articulated, that their role within negotiations will also be one that is far more, I suppose, constructive and promising.
No, thank goodness it's a bit more of a bright spot there. Going into the negotiations later this year, I'm also interested not only the US's role we've just touched on, but China has an ever-growing influence around so much of the world and probably will in these negotiations. And it seems to sit in a very interesting place on issues of climate justice and things like reparations. And how do you see China playing that role? I know it's sided with a lot of Pacific Island nations against kind of Australia's lack of climate ambition, but its approach with its Belt and Road Initiative around the world would seem to suggest something else. So how do you see, what would you like to see China doing on the international stage?
Yeah, no, of course, China has an immense influence, across the world. So their announcement last year came, of course, as a very big surprise, but also a good one. And it's great to know that they, willing to make that kind of commitment, even if it is, by 2060. But certainly, I think that China has the capacity to be able to do things much more boldly and much faster. So I think, we should just keep monitoring that, pushing that things, they don't have to only get to 2060 net zero. They can bring that forward. And I think there'll be lots of developments in the years ahead. It's very long term. We really need to know what everybody's going to be doing by 2030, actually. So in terms of what they need to do beyond that, making commitments, etc., I think because of their influential role, they have to actually also start interrogating their contribution, not just to the current emissions, but to future emissions. So it has to influence their decisions about what they're going to be investing in now. That's why I'm saying, the 2030, this decade is a critical decade to keep well below 1.5. And so what they do now is important, what they invest in, what, this Belt and Road Initiative that you're talking about, still largely investing in fossil fuel infrastructure or high emitting infrastructure. So they have to interrogate what they're doing, not only domestically, but what their relationships are in terms of external investments, what they do in Africa, what they do in other developing countries. And they don't have, they can do much better. They don't have a good record of what they're investing in, what they're exporting, what they're importing. So certainly that's going to be important. The trade relations are going to be important. And they're a big global influence, and they have to conduct themselves as such.
Thank you. Well, let's hope that comes to pass. And that was so insightful on so many subjects. Thank you very much. I'm sorry we only have such a short amount of time, but I think there's lots more talks of this nature happening throughout the day. So for everyone else, please do tune into those as well. Thank you, Tasneem.
Oh, thank you, India. Thank you very much.